from the website, I understand. So thank you very much. Today I will speak on the book, Poor Numbers, how we are misled by African development statistics and what to do about it. It is a book, as was introduced, have gotten a lot of attention. It was favorably reviewed in the Financial Times. Bill Gates reviewed it. It's been mentioned in Nature, in Lancet and so forth. But it's also generated some, not only positive attention, some negative attention too, and some controversy. And some of you might have followed some of this debate on African arguments and the Royal African Society web pages lately. That I should warn you that according to some, I am a hired gun. I am working for foreign powers, and I have single-handedly discredited national statistical offices in Africa. I need to be stopped in my tracks before I'm hijacking the African development statistics agenda. Some of these statements have been made since the publication of the book. This was particularly pertaining to when I was supposed to speak at the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa in Addis Ababa about how to do better in economic development statistics in the 21st century. I was supposed to give the opening statement. I made it from Vancouver to London, but while I was waiting to board my plane at Heathrow Airport, I got a phone call ordering me, no uncertain terms, not to board that plane. My invitation had been revoked, and my speech at UNECA was cancelled. Since then, some, and it's admirable as well, that Paleola and others in the African statistical community have changed their mind about this, has read the book and found out that maybe our standpoints are not as far away from each other as one would think. And as we speak, I do have an invitation to speak at the African Symposium for Statistics in Botswana at the end of January. Well, let's see, we'll see. I'll try to be polite and nice this meeting, so maybe I'll get there, maybe even further than Heathrow this time. So I think it's worthwhile to talk you through a little bit what my book is about. It's called Poor Numbers, and the subtitle is How We're Misled by African Development Statistics and What to Do About It. In chapter 1, well, it has 4 chapters besides the customary introduction and conclusion. As you see, you can be read in a day or two, 20 euros right here. And it has 4 chapters. The first chapter gives you an introduction to what I call the knowledge problem. What I'm asking is, how much do we really know about income and growth in Africa? And my conclusion is a bit disappointing for many of you. We know much less than we would like to think. This pertains not only to income and growth, it also leads into poverty, inequality, agricultural production, even down to basics as counting the total population. We know much less. I mean, to embrace our knowledge problem rather than to hide away from it. Chapter 2 does something quite unique, something that's not been done before, is to write the history, a very short history, and I'll give you some bits and pieces of it today, of how African economies have been measured through history. So I take you from the colonial statistical offices through the statistical offices and how their tasks changed at independence in the 1960s. I look at the institution and how it fared and what constraints it faced throughout the economic crisis in the 1970s, with radically changed landscapes in the 1980s with liberalization and structural adjustment programs, into the era of not so much focusing on growth, but on poverty reduction and those IMF and World Bank sponsored efforts until the current day, which has been written since 2000 surrounding the Millennium Development Goals, 8 goals, 18 indicators and 48 targets, which are supposed to measure how we're doing in development. What we have tend to forgotten is that at the center of this story is a statistical office, and there is a statistical office that had to fill out this giant global data sheet, and I'm suggesting that we need to refocus our effort on local data supply and under what conditions data is being constructed. Chapter 3 is a direct answer to that kind of general complaint that would come from economists and econometricians saying, yeah, there is noise in the data, we have fancy econometric techniques, if it only binds my results against 0, I'm not very worried about this. This chapter shows you with numbers, so this is numbers showing that numbers are wrong, that we cannot ignore the controversy surrounding these data sets. I take you to Nigeria, where one food production data set showed that food production was going down after removing of fertilizer subsidies and the reintroduction of high food prices. I show you another data set that showed exactly the opposite, as has been recounted by Paul Mosley in his nicely titled article, Policy Making Without Facts, which is again a play from William Stolper's book, also from Nigeria, from the 1960s, was Development Planning Without Facts. I show also further the problems, for instance, about counting the total population of Nigeria. And this is where I show that these are not facts, these are products, and in order to understand these observations, we need to understand that these are embedded in the political economy. That means, for instance, the classical example of counting populations and how difficult it was is taken from the first population in a census in Nigeria in 1953, showed a total account about 35 million or so. And this was in 1953. At this point, when the Nigerian population was counted, they had the perfect incentive to be avoid to be counted, because they correctly assumed that these records will be the basis of future taxation. So it was better not to be counted. 1963, incentives have turned exactly upside down. This time, if you were counted, you might be allowed to vote, and you might also get some funds as school funding, roads, and etc. and so forth. And in the new count in 1963, the population almost doubled in the matter of 10 years, indicating an impossible growth rate of about 10% population growth rate a year. And ever since, we've not been able to agree upon the total population in Nigeria. Today, you can download data and you'll find plus minus 50 million, around 140 or so. So this understands that not only is this a matter of, this is not facts, this is embedded in their political economy, and one needs to be a good historian and a good journalist. You need to ask yourself, who made this observation, under what circumstances was this observation made, and is there any reason to think that the observation is biased? I show a similar story from the Statistical Office in Tanzania, where before structural adjustment, the assumption in economic growth was that the unrecorded economy grew in the same pace as the recorded economy. In 1992, they revised the GDP series back to 1987 and made exactly the opposite assumption. From now on, today, the assumption is that when the recorded economy is in decline in Tanzania, the unrecorded economy is growing. So it is important to understand that many of these assumptions, which are subject, because that's one of the central problems we're interested in, what happens to the formal economy when the informal economy is growing, etc. These decisions are made at the Statistical Office, and that's why we need to look closer where we get our information from. Chapter 4 is when I have convinced you all that we have a serious knowledge problem on our hands. This is when I save the day and show you how to solve it. Yeah, this is where I present my super plan for how to solve data for development. To be serious about it, I think there are a couple of things that we need to think through when we are confronting the Millennium Development Goals or the post-MDG agenda. I'll talk through some of the things that we have forgotten in previous measurement debates and think about some fundamentals for the road ahead. Before I do so, I should tell you what GDP is and why I have done a focus on it, and also why I have done a focus on Africa in this particular book. Both things are not arbitrarily. It's a conscious choice, but it needs some justification, so you don't misunderstand what I'm saying. GDP is the sum of all goods and services produced in one area in one given year. Yeah? So you need to take the sum of that, and when you compare it with the year before, you get what you call economic growth. It is arguably the most important type of evidence on economic development, or in the financial press in general. Remember that when we had the front page of The Economist in 2001 with the hopeless continent, that was on the back of declining GDP per capita rates. Since a couple of years now, and The Economist have indeed changed their mind, now it is Africa rising. This is this year's front page. It's again on the back of rising GDP per capita debates. I'm not saying that GDP is the most correct or appropriate measure of development. Indeed, I care about human rights and literacy and mortality, infant mortality rates as much as the next one. But I think in terms of turning debates, turning heads, and making political decisions, GDP is incredibly important. I think also there has been an unhealthy academic divide, and that's why I'm particularly speaking to the African studies community, that there has been a little bit of that. Some people, economists, would accept the numbers at face value and just use whatever is available, the constraint being face availability, data availability, while others has thought data analysis is a waste of time for these particular economies. I'll dismiss all this data and not use it. What this is an invitation for is the use of interdisciplinary research skills, the use of skills of historians, political scientists, anthropologists, to understand and investigate the nature of data, not only in sub-Saharan Africa, but elsewhere as well. Also, the GDP estimates, if you're interested in statistical capacity or knowing what the states know about themselves, GDP is the perfect angle. Because if you want to aggregate GDP, you need to know about agricultural production, manufacturing, you need to know about construction of houses, you need to know about roads, you need export, import, services, you need wages, you need a total population, you need to know how much the government taxed and how much they spent and what they spent on. And then peep, comes out GDP at the end of the day. This means that on the way, you are using the full statistical system, and therefore GDP is a very nice angle to get an idea about how much the state knows about itself and how this knowledge question changes through time and space. Why am I focusing on Africa? Should go without saying, but it doesn't, so I will say it, that measurement problems are universal. And many of you have followed, for instance, measurement debates from Greece or Argentina, where it's hard to agree upon the correctness of the official numbers. So measurement problems are universal. GDP numbers do not normally include prostitution and marijuana. It does in Netherlands. But that means that in most countries this is part of the black economy, the unrecorded economy in Norway and Canada, more civilized places, where we have a different way of thinking about what is accepted economic activity and what is unaccepted economic activity. The same kind of arbitrary decisions, what's inside the household, outside the household, and so forth. These are categories, boxes, and so forth. What is being counted is a matter of decision. And the measurement problems, actually getting the information, is universal. But there are problems of measuring GDP and other things that are more acute in poor countries than others. One simple kind of thing is that if you think about the size of the economic transaction or the value of it, the smaller the value or the smaller the economic transaction is, the less likely it is that it was recorded. So it just means that in poorer countries you have less recording. There is less taxation as well. That means that states have a less incentive to actually collect the information. Here is something where Africa is set aside, for instance, from Asia or Latin America. African states have been less inclined to collect direct taxation on property and direct taxation on income, and therefore also collected less information about this. So compared to Asia, for instance, there is a bigger information problem. There is also the conjectural problem. That means that African states in the 1970s, 1980s were harder hit by the economic world crisis, and also a bigger constraint on what happens to administrations and the data collection problem there, which I will talk about at some length. Of course, there is variation in statistical capacity and the quality of data at national level. So whenever I make an average statement about the state of African statistics, I'm complimenting those who are worse than the average, and I'm insulting everyone who is better than the average. So I'm insulting South Africa and Rwanda, and I'm giving a compliment to Zambia. But, so there is a lot of variation across national levels. So you need to bear that in mind. So the knowledge problem. So first talk about the knowledge problem, then I'll talk about how that varies across space and across time, and then I'll sum it up with the governance problems, what to do about it. The symptom of a knowledge problem. On the 5th of November 2010, the Ghana Statistical Services announced that its GDP for the year 2010 was revised. It used to be 26 billion ZD, but the day after the revision, it was only 45 billion ZD. Yeah? It means that overnight, the Ghanaian economy almost doubled. It means that GDP per capita used to be around $600. It was now around $1,100. It means that Ghana used to be a low-income country. Now it was a middle-income country. On the 4th of November, it was a country eligible for concessional funding from the World Bank. On the 5th of November, it was a graduate and a middle-income country and could go to commercial banks. This is good news. Ghana is richer than we thought, but there is a knowledge problem. How did this happen? Where did this growth come from? How can such an estimate change overnight? And the global development community was confused. Todd Moss at the Center of Global Development, he exclaimed on his blog pages, "Boy, we really don't know anything." And he also went on to say that Ghana is most probably the most closely watched economy in sub-Saharan Africa. If we didn't notice this, what do we know about other countries? I think Chad was his example. And Andy Sumner and Charles Kenny went to The Guardian and wrote that Dambisa Moyo, dead aid, and Paul Collier, bottom billion, must be wrong. Ghana just escaped that poverty trap. There is no such thing as a poverty trap. And development aid is now working and so forth. United Nations Development Program based in Accra in Ghana said this is a statistical illusion. Nothing has changed for us from the 4th to the 5th of November. According to all the other indicators, there is still a poverty problem in Ghana. Shanta Drevajan, after having read the underlying paper for this book, declared Africa's statistical tragedy. And he said the tragedy is that we knew less, that we did not know how little we knew. Yeah? The knowledge problem is not isolated to Ghana. Africa might be much richer than we think. Here's the good news again. Nigeria is expected to announce new rebased GDP numbers maybe next year. Last year it was maybe this year. We'll see when it actually comes out. The technical advisors are working hard on it as well. I met Yemi Kale in Washington, D.C., the director of Nigerian Bureau of Statistics. He says probably spring 2014, not sure yet. And again, the revision looks like it could be on the size of the one in Ghana. They may double. It means that maybe Nigeria is bigger than South Africa. It means that maybe a different country should be sitting around the potential opening seat at the Security Council. It means a different country sitting in the G20s. It also implies if Nigeria is only half of what it actually should be, it means that sub-Saharan African GDP alone is 15%, too low, because Nigeria is, you know, give or take 50 million, around 150 million people. Yeah? It also means that right now, for you who are interested in aggregate trends in poverty and growth in Africa, and Africa rising or not, right now there are about 40 Malawis, somewhere hidden, unaccounted for inside the Nigerian economy. So there is a knowledge problem here. And if you start looking then to where you would go to get this data, if you're downloading GDP data, you probably go to the World Bank. You go to the World Bank Development Indicators. And you'll find nicely and orderly all countries' data from 1960 to 2012. But then you start asking yourself, not all countries have actually published data for 2012. What happens now with Ghana? How is that reported? There was a break, that jump. How did they put that back? There are breaks in this series. So you start asking yourself, where do they get this data from? So where does the data come from? And I hope you remember this. The data comes from the statistical offices. So at the heart of this story is the statistical services. This is Ghana, Accra. You'll find, I'm walking out of the screen, that right here, this is the statistical offices. I used to consult with my interviews here with the chief of macroeconomic statistics there and asking him about the forthcoming revision. People were surprised when Ghana's GDP were revised. I knew it already because I was talking to him in February, so I knew when it was coming. It was about 40 to 50%. I increased a little bit since I left. And right here is, by the way, is the informal economy, a peanut saleswoman, where I used to buy my lunch in the break time and get. And I was asking Duncan, you know, is she counted in the new estimates? And he said, it's just peanuts. But it turns out when you stack up peanuts, all of them, they in a pile, they do count for something. Here's the Living Standard Survey, Nigeria, Abuja, still in the bags when I was there. It's being entered, and we're eagerly awaiting the numbers to be ready for Nigeria so we can know what's actually going on with the Nigerian economy. So, in order to understand this, how do they come up with this change number in Ghana and elsewhere? We need to go to the statistical offices, and get the information from there. So first then I'm going to give you National Accounting's 101. For those who haven't estimated on this, should be basic how to do GDP calculations. I'll just do it very briefly for you. GDP is measured first by the Keynes identity, which is that GDP here represented by Y. Don't ask me why, but that's how economists do it. Y is income, of course, in the X and Y kind of thing. And its GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government expenditure plus exports and minus imports. That is, all GDP, all goods and services has to be expended. Or all GDP has to be earned. That means that all goods and services has to be paid for by someone, so it has to be the wages, profits and rents. So you can sum up all that. It should be same to the expenditure approach. Or finally, all goods and services has to be produced. So you just collect all the information you have on all production, value added, agriculture, mining, manufacturing, construction, trade and transport, public services. That's in theory. In theory, you can add up all of this, and then they should match and all that stuff, and you have a complete nice system, double bookkeeping. It's perfect in the accountant's world. In the Sub-Saharan Africa typical statistical office, the data availability constrains what you're able to do here. In the expenditure approach, you will be lacking the consumption item, crucially, particularly on an annual basis. You simply don't know how much personal consumption changes from year to year. Your investment data will be biased. You'll be capturing ports and highways, but you won't be capturing land clearing or other kinds of smaller activities. Government expenditure, you have good data on export and imports. Yeah, fair enough. There is no smuggling. Sometimes there is a lot of smuggling, sometimes there isn't. The wages, profits and rents is a non-starter. We're talking about an economy which is made up by a lot of individuals and small scale, medium scale individuals who do not keep wage records, profit records, or the rent is not normally charged in a regular way. The way that it is done is to add up production. So you add up what is produced in any year. So that means that you go through the industrial sector kind of classification. You add up what in 1 year, you add up all the information you have on each sector in value added, and then you distribute it and so forth as you go. So that meant last time they did this in Ghana, when they have the data availability, was in 1993. Okay? So then they added up all they had on agriculture, all they have on manufacturing, all they have on mining, construction, retail, communication, services, and GDP, and so forth, like that. You get your sum. Now you would think, and indeed that's how it's done in Norway, Netherlands, and so forth, that in 1994 they would just do the same thing and then compare the sum again. Instead, how it's done is to take a shortcut because you don't have the annual data, so use some kind of proxy. So instead of having all the data on agricultural sector and recalculate that, you use the trends in some observed crops. Food production you might use as rainfall data or population growth. On manufacturing, you get some information for 2 or 3 firms using your business registry. Mining, you'll collect some information from the big companies. Construction, no information whatsoever, so you often use cement imports or population. Retail, wholesale, no information on that part of the economy on an annual basis. So you just say, I think it's maybe 50% of agriculture, 50% agriculture, maybe mining a little bit, and you make a guess, the best guess you can. Communications, services and so forth. You might collect some records from the public telephone company. You might have some information from the railways, maybe licenses of taxi drivers applied for that last year or something like that. You use the data you have and use a proxy. In 1994, this might be a reasonable guess. 1995, still. 97, getting a bit off. 98, according to IMF, you're already now in dangerous territory. Into the 2000s, yes, it's been a long while since you had a proper update. And this went on until 2010, when they did the sum again. And they did a new sum for 2006. And they found out, in the meantime, half of the economy went missing. Yeah? And that's why you get this new jump. Now, this is how it's done. And that's the central. So when you need to ask yourself, when you're looking at GDP estimates, you need to know what's the base year. When was there last a household budget survey? Has there ever been a population census? When was it conducted? Has there ever been any collection of agricultural statistics in this country or not? And so forth, and you have to break your way through and then judge for yourself. I wanted to know, what does the bank do when there are these breaks? Because now we have a problem. We have a reasonable picture of Ghana in 1993, a reasonable picture of Ghana in 2006. The in-between land Where did that extra half of Ghana come from? We don't know. So it will be then a decision made in the World Bank how to put this data together. And what do they do, for instance, with Equatorial Guinea, who don't publish data, or Eritrea, or other countries which are not yet done with their estimates? Then the bank uses, in order to fill the data gap, they have a method, according to the manual, which is called the method for filling the data gap. So in order to fill the data gap, they have a method which is called the gap filling method. It is a bit discretionary, I've been told, when I presented this paper to the World Bank Data Group, that sometimes this means really taking the average. You don't have data in Somalia, so you take the average of Kenya and Sudan. Other times it means that you borrow data from other countries that are similar. When you have regional output data, when you don't have all the data from West Africa, you assume that the rest of West Africa grows in line with West Africa. You might make projections like you will do in Nigeria. You don't know what happened between 1996 and 1993 and 2006. You draw a regression line. You make some projections. Or you make a phone call to the guy who sits in Ethiopia and say, you know, what do you think? The Ethiopians just said 12%. Do you buy that? No, 7.6 rather. And that's how these discretionary methods are used to fill this gap. It's not very well documented. I was interested because I couldn't make sense of the Tanzanian data. If you look into it, it's described in the book. According to the data in 1987, the Tanzanians' economy, according to the Penwell tables, drops 33%, and I couldn't figure out why. So I wanted to know the World Bank, what did you do? Because the Penwell tables had no idea what they did. So I at least thought that the World Bank should know what they did, and so I asked them to see the raw data. How did you put this together? And so I asked them, and they said raw data provided by the national statistical agencies are not available for external users, and only a handful of people at the World Bank have access to it. When I presented this again to the World Bank Data Group in 2010, they told me this, I was mistaken. They were available, and I still have not accessed that raw data. I've gotten some of the Ghana data now to try to make sense of it. Turns out that the Ghana was not accounted for the 1993 base year. They were still using the 1975 base year in the World Bank database. They told me no access to the raw data, but they did give me this very piece of advice, which I think goes in the category of easier said than done. You may want to visit the national statistical offices yourself, which I tried to do. So between 2007 and 2010, I've been going to Ghana, to Nigeria, to Uganda, to Kenya, to Tanzania, to Zambia, to Malawi, and Botswana, where I've done interviews and I've done archival works where there was gaps in the archives to write the history of how these economies have been measured, what kind of data do we have, and trying to build up the source material, how those political changes affect how things are measured, how does that affect our judgment of African growth. I've done an email survey, so I'm therefore then and phone, covering Burundi, Cameroon, Cape Verde, Guinea, Lesotho, Mali, Mauritania, Mauritius, Morocco, Namibia, Mozambique, Niger, Senegal, Seychelles, and South Africa. So then giving me a confident basis all to say something to you about our knowledge problem and how it looks like. And in order to do that, I want to ask you, one of the things we need to do that, we need to ask ourselves two questions, one about validity and one about reliability. So the validity question is GDP correctly measured? You already know the answer to that. The answer is no, it isn't. It never is. It's always an approximation. This is not so important, that the validity problem is, in Ghana, apparently the validity problem was of quite big proportions. The validity problem in Norway is maybe 3 or 4%. In other places it has been bigger, and other places it is smaller. The question really is the validity problem consistent? That means, is it reliable? So is the mismeasurement consistent across space? So can you now compare Ghana to Nigeria? You cannot, right? Because they are on different bases. And the other question is, can you compare Ghana today with Ghana 10 years ago? The answer is yes. Again, you cannot, because the measurement have changed. So in a way of thinking about it is that you have a bathroom scale at home where you can measure your own weight. you are probably, that bathroom scale, unless you have the very new, brand new digital ones, might be having some mismeasurement. It has this scale thing that comes up and then it settles on a number. It might be, 2 or 3 kilos off on one side, but that doesn't matter because you're only interested in whether you're gaining or losing weight. Your total weight is of no relevance, and nor do we want to know it. And you shouldn't ask anyone else what it is either. The problem becomes when you do that, and you do that in national statistics, don't you? You rank countries according to how much they weigh. Moreover, so that means you should not lean over the fence and ask your neighbor how much his weight is. And the other one is that if you are interested in whether you're gaining or losing weight, you should keep the same weight. The confusion in GDP statistics in Africa is as if someone snuck in the middle of the night and exchanged the bathroom scales of you and your neighbor. You do not know who's the heaviest and at what rate you are gaining weight. So let's look at the validity problem. So this is the table, also in the book, tells you in the first column, this was conducted in 2010, when was the, 2011, sorry, when was the last estimate available? You see, for instance, here then at Ghana had then as up-to-date data as the World Bank had. So they both had data for 2009. If you went to Equatorial Guinea, you had to go back to 2002. Central African Republic hadn't done any data since 2003, and so forth. So the gap time, according to UNECA now, the gap time is on average 2 years backwards. So that varies quite a lot. The other one is the base year. Now remember what was really important in Ghana was that the base year went from 1993 to 2006. So you see here, base year of Ghana is 2006. Now why are we expecting such an upward revision in Nigeria? Is that they haven't changed their base year since 1990. So we are approaching almost a quarter of a century since we had an appropriate picture of what is possibly the biggest economy in sub-Saharan Africa. So these are the kinds of knowledge gaps and mismeasurement, validity and reliability problems. How does it look across time? I will not have time to go through this fully, so I will, this is called a very short history of statistical capacity. This will be a rather extremely short one, I think. This GDP measure does not only vary across time, the information and what is considered politically important at the statistical office does also vary across time, and not only across space, but also across time. That means that, for instance, the colonial states were not very interested in agricultural production and consumption. They were interested in taxes, and they were interested in exports and imports. And that meant that, for instance, that in Uganda, external trade statistics were collected in Mombasa. That's a problem if you know where Mombasa is, because Mombasa is in Kenya. That made sense for the East African Statistical Department. It does still not make sense for Kampala or for Uganda, but still the formal trade statistics is dominantly collected in Mombasa for Uganda. So there's some roots of the current system there. At independence, you get a completely different new demands. You get population censuses. You have more administrative data. Here's a crucial distinction to make. Survey data versus administrative data. Administrative data is the kind of data that governments have access to based on their day-to-day operation. So it means that if a government moves people, moves goods, invests in agriculture, it will have data on agricultural goods and movement of people. If it doesn't involve itself in it. So in a sense, statistical priority signals political priority. If you are wondering whether Liberia has worried much about agricultural statistics lately, go and check how much the government have published on agricultural statistics in Liberia. You will find quite little. And this is then another way of thinking about, we talk about governance, quality, state capability. For mine, there is lots of different indicators out there. My best bet is to go to a well-stocked library, like the one in Leiden, bring your ruler, and measure the length of the library shelf in statistical publications per each country. It will be misleading, right? But there will be more types. You will see that there is more stuff in the 60s There's less stuff in the 70s, absolutely nothing in the 1980s, and then a bit more in the 90s and 2000. Also, look it up per sector. You'll find industrial statistics, labor statistics in the 60s and the 70s. None of that since in the 80s and the 90s. But you will find social statistics. You will find infant mortality statistics. So the change of what is being measured, how we measure it, and how we count it changes very much with the kind of political priority. The change I'm also emphasizing here is the change I talked about in Tanzania. The shock to the statistical system where many of the data that used to be collected through parastatal, through the goods, the states collecting and buying goods and so forth, went out, and we have a liberalization. So there is, for statistical offices, they have less to count for with less resources. And more recently, there has been an emphasis on survey data. So that means that with the poverty agenda and the Millennium Development Agenda, there has been more money, ad hoc money, available for particular surveys. Survey data is the kind of data that is collected when someone has money to allocate to finding out what's the size of a particular problem. So you do a poverty survey, do a living standard survey, and so forth. And these can be conducted not so often. A standard living standard survey takes 2 years to complete. You need to do an adequate sample, 3,000 households, cost 3 to 5 million for Nigeria, maybe $10 million. And it will give you data, but you don't have that kind of data all the time. The problem is that the Millennium Development Goals, as I mentioned, as I argue, has been placing new demands on an already weakened statistical office. What I mean by that is that these countries are already struggling to deliver particular data on economic governance, but are now being asked to fill different demands for evidence-based policy. And that means that they are being pulled from certain activities and then to garner to donor demands. And what you get in the result is often policy-driven evidence instead of evidence-driven policy, and that is exactly the opposite of what you wanted. So for the growth evidence, as I made very, very clear, any ranking of African countries according to GDP is going to be misleading. Any statement over growth over short or medium term is likely to be affected. Very recent growth data is overestimated. Africa is rising a little bit, but not as much as we think based on the data. And some countries are richer than we think. The governance problem, what to do about it? I'll have some lessons, and I can get into more of this in the questions. Data users need to do their job better. Not only you, everyone. You need to question your evidence. As the good journalist, you have to think that statistics are not facts, they're products. You need to ask who made this observation, under what conditions was it made, what could have constrained the observation, is it biased? Data disseminators need to label their product correctly. The World Bank is doing a better job now than it did 2 years ago. So it's already, since the meeting I had with them, they're already doing, for instance, now reporting base years. They didn't do that now. IMF reported it also and replicated my study in their latest regional outlook report for Africa. But I think maybe they could do a little bit more. I think maybe when there are no data, you should not report it. It should maybe be a blank when you don't have any information, not make up data. I think it could be color coding, red, green, go ahead, don't use it kind of thing. In Zambia, in the national statistical reports there, they have 1 asterisk, 1 star if it's a guesstimate, and 2 stars if it's a very weak guesstimate. I don't know the distinction between guesstimate and very weak guesstimate, but I think that it means that you're guessing when you're tired, or you're guessing when you're not really paying attention. But anyhow, something, I'm not suggesting they should adopt that one, but there might be, is this data, that means something that's given, or is it something you made up yourself? There should be a distinction. Donors need to coordinate. There has been lots of nice, beautiful documents, national strategies for statistics development, undersigned by Paris 21 and so forth. They are not being followed because donors do use their ad hoc funding. They do use the power of per diems, and then do follow their own priorities rather than national priorities. That means that data producers need to align, to find their priorities, and demand the kind of statistic that they want. So we need a new agenda for data for development in sub-Saharan Africa, where we put local demand in the center. That means that we need to make decisions about what to collect, not in Washington, D.C., nor in London. That means that we don't have labor statistics that are useful, for instance, for most countries. Why don't we? This is what presidents are elected and not elected upon. We have now quite misleading data on access to clean water. Is that exactly the data we need and don't need? Maybe you should ask the voters. So we need to document there. I think a lot of scholarship can be done there. Incentives, we need to think about incentives. These statistical offices will respond to them. If there is funds made available to leave your desk and go collect data or to attend a workshop somewhere, rather to be there and actually produce the data, they will leave their desk and don't produce the data. Statistical offices like central banks across the region are frustrated that they don't get electricity data or cement data. And therefore, we need to think about how to change those incentives. That means changes to the reward structure. And that means that it needs to be carrots and sticks in how to coordinate the data. We need to think about applicability. In the game of global statistics, the key is always to do a balance between global standards and local applicability. So you need to think about data that has use and has relevance at the local level as well as the global level. Currently, the new data revolution agenda is written too much from the demand side and too much from the global standard side. We're not thinking through who needs the data and for what. So to conclude, numbers matter. Any evaluation of Africa's development must begin and end with a careful evaluation of the growth and income evidence. Without such analysis, one do run the risk of reporting statistical fiction. There's lots of scholarship out there having done that mistake. I expose some of it in the book, but there's still being, those kind of mistakes are still being committed. Numbers need to be engaged critically. This means that we should reawake in African studies and use interdisciplinary research skills to question numbers. Numbers is not only for statisticians and for economists, it's for historians, it's for political scientists, it's for anthropologists and others, sociologists. Don't limit yourself. It means because who is counts, by whose authority the final number is agreed upon is critical. Poor numbers are just too important to be dismissed as just that. Thank you very much.